On today's episode, I'm joined by Tom Murray, educator, thought leader, and author, as we talk about why diving into people's hidden stories can be some of the most important work that we're doing in education today. Welcome to Focus on K-12, EdTech and the Education Experience. I'm your host, Doug Konopelko, Education Strategist at CDWG. So let's dive in as we focus on K-12.
Hey everybody, Tom Murray here. So excited to be joining the podcast. Doug, thank you for having me on. I've spent time as an educator in classrooms, leading buildings, leading districts, and now getting to work nationally. And it is such an honor. I'm a big fan of the podcast. Thanks for having me here today.
Thanks, Tom. So, you've written a few books, right? And the most recent one, Personal and Authentic, I think has really hit home for a lot of people. So give me like the Cliff Notes version, if that's still a thing, Cliff Notes. Give me the Cliff Notes version of the book.
I don't know why I just had flashbacks to middle school and high school and like going to the store to get those little yellow things when I was like really late on an assignment, right? Not that you had that feeling. I had a friend that told me about that one time. Anyway, thanks for asking about that. Writing Personal and Authentic, a lot of times people ask kind of why did I write it? And I really felt that there were stories that needed to be told. And I also felt like we really needed to refocus ourselves on what it was that was most important. When we look at the piece, a lot of times I think we've really pushed the envelope on things like data and testing and all that stuff. And structures have created environments where people have the pressure to feel like they've had to do that. But at the end of the day, our kids are not data points and test scores walking through hallways. How do we leverage the interests, the passions, the strengths? How do we make experiences more personal, more authentic in nature? And the title really came out of a way I would always phrase the question to educators as we would vision forward on how do we make learning personal and authentic? Because when we take a look at those kinds of examples, we're thinking about situations that are unique. And it doesn't mean there's not a time to stand in front of a classroom and address it. But when we look at things that are personal and authentic, it's really the experiential side that matters most. As a listener, think back to your experience that you had in high school or whatever it is. And typically the things that you remember, the things that are really ingrained in that brain of yours are often the things that were experiential in nature. And so with that, the book really starts by taking a look at leadership, culture, and really what's our role with that. I really wanted educators to examine their own hearts, their own minds, and really be reflective. One of the things you will not find in the book is anytime that I pat myself on the back, talk about here's how I did it perfectly. You won't find that. But what you will find, Doug, is myself being vulnerable, sharing where I messed it up, sharing where my mindset was off, sharing where I needed a kick in the butt from a mentor to get my mind on the right thing and make sure I was kid-centered and not me-centered. And so when we take a look at that, really setting the tone for that environment, creating experiences for kids that leave that thumbprint of impact. One of the analogies I make throughout the book is that educators really get to leave their fingerprints of impact on students for generations to come. And the difficulty about being an educator is you don't always feel it. I know the feeling of driving home, having tears streaming down my face, feeling like I'm totally ineffective, or looking across the hall, watching a mentor veteran teacher with kids running to them, like crushing it and making it so it seems so seamless. And I'm just trying to keep my head above water. So part of it is really wanting to also give people hope. And so not just being kid-centered, but giving people hope and then being really practical in nature. I amplify a lot of voices throughout Personal and Authentic because I recognize my voice as a white male that grew up in middle-class America is one voice. It's not wrong. It's one voice that a lot of kids in our school systems can't relate to or don't understand. And so throughout, lots of teachers, principals, superintendents added their thoughts, added their input. I have multiple co-authors for multiple sections because I wanted to leverage their voices in topic areas that they could certainly write better than I could from a different viewpoint. And so with those pieces, also wanted to be really practical in giving educators really ways that they can actually do these things in the classrooms. A lot of books are 50,000 foot view or philosophical, theoretical. I wanted it to be uber practical so they could read a chapter, turn around in their classroom and say, okay, tomorrow I'm going to try this, this, and this. At the end of the day, I can't do any sort of podcast without recognizing the incredible perseverance and courage of educators, especially in these moments in the midst of a pandemic. And so I hope that the book has been very supportive for them and encouraging because they really are the greatest people in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that at the beginning of all of your talks, right, all of your keynotes, you start with that idea of thank you, right? And I think that that's so important, especially now, right, when people are struggling, right? We've got a lot of things going on right now, right? You mentioned the pandemic. We've got social injustice and systemic racism that we're battling. We've got a recent election that has people, even within families, kind of at each other's throats, right? So, in the midst of all that, what do you think is resonating most with people from the book?
Yeah. So one of the people will often ask me, and I think to me, I'm going to answer it the same way. They'll say, Tom, what was your favorite part of the book as an author? For me, in chapter 3, I write about my daughter's medical journey. And she was born with really significant food allergies to the point where we've almost lost her 3 times. One of it is I coined that chapter, The Hidden Stories Within. You know, you mentioned all the things around systemic racism, some of the things, the issues around our country this summer, the injustices that have always occurred and, are not new by any means, but have really been put under a new spotlight. And part of the reason I felt like it was important to amplify in personal and authentic, I'll give you 2 examples real quick. One of the sections, as I really researched, how do we make learning personal? How do we make learning authentic? When we take a look at cultural relevance, I recognize that that's not my story to tell. So I reached out to Dr. Rosa Perez Isaiah, a real good friend of mine, came to the United States as an immigrant, didn't speak English, and she's now crushing it with a doctorate, leading a school system in California. She's got a very different understanding about racism, about those kinds of things than Tom Murray does. When I wrote about equity, I asked my good friend Ken Shelton to write that with me. As a Black male, he's got a very different understanding and life view than Tom Murray does. So I share those pieces because they all relate to story. Ken and Rosa have different stories than Tom Murray does. And I felt that it was really important that the readers saw different lenses, different stories. In chapter 3, when I talk about the hidden stories within, I share my daughter's medical journey and I share the data. And part of the reason I share my daughter's data, with my daughter's permission, by the way, is I'll give examples and share how she was absent for 35 days and she was tardy 20 times in a 14-month period. If we just looked at her data, we would look at, and I'll ask educators all the time. In fact, when I'm speaking, I'll often put a slide up and just give the data and say, pretend you're getting the student tomorrow. What are the judgments, if we're really honest, that we might make? And what do we hear? Well, the kid's lazy. Why are they disconnected? Parents obviously don't care. Maybe there's drugs involved. Maybe she's pregnant, taking care of an older sibling, staying up all night. School's not a priority. And we could rattle off all the things that might cross her mind. But the moment that I tell you what it was like at 10 months old, when our friends came over for dinner and brought hummus, and she happened to get at 10 months old a little bit on her hand, and she just rubbed her eye, what it was like as a dad to watch her almost become lifeless as anaphylaxis sat in, gasping for air. Or if I told you what it was like running into that hospital, screaming for an EpiPen with tears streaming, like literally praying to God to save my daughter, and watching an EpiPen be injected for the very first time and kind of watching her come back to life. And what if I told you what it was like then in all of those 14 months, what it was like in all of those 35 absences, what it was like every time she would be on the road because she traveled 10,000 miles and drove for 180 hours in that time, of what it was like when she would say, Mommy, I really wish I could be in school today. Or Daddy, I really wish I could be in school today. You see, it's the hidden stories within. You see, that is 14 months later. She now eats the equivalent of 2,000 seeds every single day. She's the first child in the Northeast that we know of to undergo this therapy. And the reason I share that is because when she walks into your classroom, you don't see it. You would have no idea. Yet it's something that's on her mind, on her heart all of the time. And so when we look at that, sharing her story, real personal, and I get emotional every time I tell it on a stage of those things, because for me, that's my baby girl. And when people understand, well, that's part of the story, we're doing this to keep her safe, and she's in a doctor's office 2 hours from her home when she'd rather be in school. Yeah, I get those absences. I can understand. So here's my point. I really believe the difference between making a judgment and having empathy is understanding the story. And I really also believe that a child's story defines the context in which the learning occurs. I'll give you some examples. Like we were just talking about, stories of racism, stories of abuse, stories of neglect, stories of hope, stories of opportunity, stories of love. And those are the students that right now are logging onto our Zooms. Those are the students at a time where fear and anxiety and everything on the outside of our walls are logging onto our Zooms, whose parents may have just lost a job, who are logging onto our Zooms. It's why we need to lead with that empathy lens. And the other piece to remember is every colleague has a hidden story as well. And hidden doesn't always mean bad. Like, Doug, maybe you're super fired up today because something's coming up you're really looking forward to. And I don't know that, right? But maybe you're struggling today. And maybe as a listener, you're struggling today because you've got something on your heart that's deep. We're really struggling with trauma in the midst of this pandemic. And it's why we need to lead in our work with an empathy lens.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's so important too to think about that, right, in all of our interactions, right? I always, if I think back and all the times that somebody went speeding by me on the road and I was just thinking like, what is this person doing? Right. But that could have been Tom Murray in that car, right, with his daughter, right, on the way to the
Yeah.
hospital. Now,
Doug,
is
here's
everybody speeding by Tom Murray on the way to the hospital? No, but the point is that we don't know the hidden story, right?
yeah, and I had a mentor one time. I was struggling with this one class as an early teacher with some behavior issues. The way I looked at it originally, and at first my mindset's kind of like, well, these kids, and why they have to be in my classroom? And a mentor one time challenged my mindset and started to say, why are they crying out to you for help? And if every time a kid was acting up or acting or looking at that disrespectful, they're in a spot where they feel safe to cry out to you for help, maybe we can get to why they're doing so. And that completely reframed it from me taking things personally to recognize there's something on this child's heart that's missing, that's hurting, that's whatever. How can I help them as opposed to that? And we know times people will take things out on the people that they care about the most, right? Because they feel it's kind of safe to do so. And it took a mentor and it took people around me to help me have that lens, but it's really the hidden stories we have, and we all have them. And so leading with that empathy lens, no matter what our role is really vital.
Yeah, I think empathy is also one of those things we hear about more and more, especially in the times we're in. But it can be one of those things too that's more difficult to implement, right? So what are some ways, some practical ways that people can do this work and bring this into their work? This idea of either leading with an empathy lens or with exploring those hidden stories.
Yeah. So first, I would say the work we do is all about relationships. So anything that you can do to build relationships and to build trust will foster a foundation for all of these pieces. Bottom line is if kids don't trust you, if you don't have the relationship, at the end of the day, they don't really care what you know. And that's kind of that old adage of they don't really care what you know until they know you care. And I really believe that relationship and fostering that relationship and those connections is really key. It's why I'm a huge proponent of being continuous with our culture building. Whether if I'm a principal, that's an ongoing thing with my staff. It's not a one and done. It's not a first day of the year kickoff kind of thing, but the building relationships is key. The second thing I would say is I've really seen a lot of this. I really believe more in the pandemic is just be vulnerable and be real. Every step of the way, you get this pressure of I have to feel like I have it all together. Things are perfect. Whether if I'm a teacher, my lesson plans are perfect. If I'm a superintendent, everything in our district, we've got it all together. Got my tie on. Right. And when we think about these pieces, people relate to vulnerability. It's why in my book, or when I stand on a stage, I will never stand on a stage and, tell people how well I did something, but I tell people how my mindset was off, how it was me that was my mindset in the way was in the way before I could redefine what was possible. So I think vulnerability is also a key there. Third is recognizing you're not alone. I will tell you, one of the worst phrases of 2020 is social distancing, because we need to be more socially connected than ever before. Physical distancing, I get. But I will tell you, teaching when we close that door can be a really lonely place. Being a principal, when we close that door, can be a really lonely place. And now with a pandemic, when we're doing a lot of things remotely, we magnify and amplify that. So it's recognizing that we're not alone, which also means if you feel alone, we've got to find people, accountability partners per se, friends like you, Doug, that can text me or that can text, how you doing, checking in on your family, how are things going? Are you prioritizing your family? Or are you all you're doing is working 20 hours a day? We need those people in our lives to keep us accountable, to give us hope, but also to give us that push when it's our mindset, when they recognize, man, you talked about self-care, but I haven't seen you do anything with your family for 2 months. Tell me about that. We need those people in our lives to be able to do that. And so I think when we look at some of those pieces, it's really foundational in being able to create those personal and authentic relationships with our kids as well as our learning experiences. So
Yeah, well, I think that's something that's come up a few times, even just on the show, right? Is this idea of people talking about self-care, but then sending an email about self-care at 11:30 at night, right, to their staff, and understanding that we're not modeling the behavior that we want to see. So, Tom, I want to tell you, thank you so much for sharing some of your story today, right, and also giving us just a lot to think about.
absolutely, Doug, I appreciate you having me on. Thanks for the time.
Thanks for joining us today on Focus on K-12 EdTech and the Education Experience. If you enjoyed today's show, please feel free to like, subscribe, and click the little bell so that you get notified whenever we post a new episode. Or reach out to me on Twitter @dconopelco. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time as we focus on K-12.